happy little games. Hello my friends, welcome to PatmanQC's 4th of July compilation celebration. A wise man who ran a Quickie Mart once said,
"Celebrate the independence of your nation by blowing up a small part of it."
Which is exactly what I'm going to do. Now that the sale of fireworks are legal in the great state of Illinois, and myself being a law-abiding citizen having never purchased those fireworks when they were illegal, so the entire family and I went to our local fireworks stand and made our selection of firecrackers, bottle rockets, ring dings, and various other earth-shattering goodies and made our way to the counter. After placing all the contraband on the counter, I asked to speak to the manager. The employee asked what it was all about, and I said, "I was in here last week, and I think you sold me some defective fireworks." Anyway, the 4th of July is a time to celebrate our independence. This country allows us freedoms that simply does not exist anywhere else in the world. For example, if I wanted to become rich and famous and build an amusement park in my backyard, it's my constitutional right. If I wanted to pal around young teenage boys and make them dress just like me, it's my constitutional right. If I wanted to dress like a certain Caped Crusader and embarrass the hell out of my kids, it's my constitutional right. God bless America. This compilation video started out as patriotic ones, but unfortunately, I haven't done a whole lot of patriotic video games. I've done over 200 of these mini documentaries over the last 4 years, so what it boils down to are videos that invoke the American spirit. Whether it's blowing things up, rescuing hostages, or just becoming a hero. If you've seen all my videos before,
please disperse. Nothing to see here, please.
Otherwise, grab a hot dog, perhaps a bag of chips, and something to drink. Because this is the 4th of July compilation celebration. Patriotism in video games has been around for a long time. There's nothing better than celebrating your love for the country than blowing up a piece of it. Speaking strictly of retro games, look no further than Duke Nukem 3D. We all know Duke came here to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and he was all out of gum. But that didn't stop him from blasting the alien pig-like scum back to where they came from. Another one that clearly feels like an American defending his soil would have to be Contra. Clearly the influence for this game was the characters of Rambo and John Matrix from Commando. Another one where the president is kidnapped, and if you were a bad enough dude, you were rewarded with a nice big cheeseburger. Today, though, we are talking about a real American hero. This particular individual would rise up against oppression and defend not only his honor, but the honor of his fellow teammates. No, I'm not talking about professional wrestler G.I. Bro. I'm talking about the classic military team of G.I. Joe, and more specifically, the G.I. Joe arcade game from Konami. What was the original IP that Konami wanted to bring to the arcades but were unable to? So let's lock and load, and remember, I've got just 2 words for you.
Yo, Joe!
This is the history of G.I. Joe from Konami. The year is 1991, and the higher-ups at Konami are looking to continue their successful arcade run of licensed IPs. The most successful for the company was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Followed up by the extremely successful Simpsons arcade game. And to a lesser extent, Aliens, and roller games.
1 point! 3 points!
The company had recently acquired the license for the upcoming Batman sequel and was looking to create an arcade game based on the property just in time for the 1992's movie release. Konami had mistakenly thought that the license would allow them to create both home and arcade titles based on the property, but unfortunately, it only allowed for the home market. In its place, they decided to use a real American hero by the name of G.I. Joe. G.I. Joe had been around since 1964, back when it was still cool for little boys everywhere to play with dolls. Now, I'm not one to talk because I played with my 8-inch Mego superheroes when I was 8 years old as well. These were not to be referred to as dolls since parents would not buy little boys' dolls to play with, so the word doll was never to be used. Thus the term action figure was born. The original line of action figures were 12 inches with cloth uniforms and lots of accessories. Now, even though I'm old enough that all I do whenever I go to the toilet is crap dust, these were a bit before my time. I had the 3.75-inch figures and vehicles growing up, but was never fortunate enough to have a 12-inch one. The series would go on for over 10 years until finally reinventing itself as a 3.75-inch tall plastic action figure. He also took up the moniker of a real American hero, and once again there were loads of accessories and vehicles to play with. In 1989, a cartoon series was produced by DIC Enterprises entitled G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. This is what the Konami arcade game is based on. The developers of the arcade game wanted something that had featured plenty of cartoon violence and lots of explosions. They also wanted to carry over the 4-player co-op feature that was so successful in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and The Simpsons. This would not be the titular team's first foray into the world of computer chips and silicone diodes. That honor would go to 1983's G.I. Joe Cobra Strike on the Atari 2600. The graphics actually looked pretty good on the primitive machine. In 1985, Epic Software released G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero for the Commodore 64 and Apple II. This is the one I remember the most growing up as a kid, and it was fantastic. Different gameplay styles along with cutscenes and excellent graphics. The image of Duke telling you to turn the disc over will forever be etched in my mind. The toys were introduced in the European market under the Action Man line known as Action Force. In 1987, Action Force was released for the Commodore 64, Amstrad, and ZX Spectrum, which looks to be just a choplifter knockoff. There were also a couple of games for the NES that received positive reviews as well. If you'd like me to do a more comprehensive review of these games, let me know in the comments down below. G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero was released by Konami in 1992. As the story goes, the ruthless Cobra Commander and his Cobra Vipers and Toxo Vipers are attempting to take over the world. They have infiltrated the big cities, and it's up to your team to band together and take them down. The story is told through excellent cinematics, which is par for the course for Konami games at this time. Large, detailed, animated sprites with plenty of scaling and rotation really pull you into the story. Yo, Joe! As I mentioned, the game is a 4-player simultaneous co-op affair in which you have your choice of Duke, Roadblock, Scarlet, or Snake Eyes. Unfortunately, they all appear to play exactly the same. There are 3 large missions to complete. The first one is separated into 3 subsections. The second mission has 2, and the final one has only 1. The gameplay is a third-person over-the-shoulder on-rail shooter in which you have to shoot and blow up anything that moves. The perspective reminds me of the arcade game Operation Thunderbolt minus the light gun. Your primary weapon of attack is your gun, and your secondary attack is your missile launcher. You only have a certain amount when you start the game, but more are available on the playfield. You have a life bar which will deplete with the more damage you take. Thankfully, there are a few power-ups littered throughout the playfield, including rapid fire, missiles, and health kits. At the end of each stage, you have to fight a massive sub-boss. The in-game graphics are fantastic with smooth, detailed animation and large character sprites. It is pure chaos when unleashing your weapon on the vile Cobra, but there is something oh so satisfying about blowing up everything on the screen. And I do mean everything, because with enough bullets and rockets, even buildings will crumble in your wake. The sound effects are superb with loud, digitized artillery samples. It wouldn't be a G.I. Joe arcade game without the team yelling out Yo Joe when Cobra even yells out Cobra as their battle cry. For some strange reason, Snake Eyes even yells out Yo Joe even though he's a mute in the cartoon. Certain bosses are absolutely mammoth, with some of them taking up the entire screen. Yes, they do look a little chunky, but for a 1992 arcade game, they still look pretty impressive. The backgrounds are nicely detailed with plenty of color and lots of parallax scrolling on display. In between each mission are some nice cutscenes that further set up the story. The game uses the same assets from the cartoon and popular toy line in this game. If you were a fan of the series growing up, you will immediately recognize all of the vehicles and characters throughout. The game takes place across 8 stages involving 3 missions. The first mission takes place on an airfield which includes a chemical plant, an airbase, and Cobra's weapon plant. The second mission takes place in the jungle, and also a cavern base. And the third mission takes place on a battleship. The mini-bosses you encounter are Tomax and Zammot, Metalhead, Baroness, Major Blood, Destro, and finally the Cobra Commander.
Yo!
After you defeat the Cobra Commander, the story unfolds with a nice cutscene as peace once again is brought to the world. The game was released in 1992, and although Konami was able to release it in the arcades, they did not have the home license, which at that time was held by Capcom. This means that no home conversions were ever released. It would have been a struggle putting this on any of the 16-bit home systems, although it might have fared pretty good on the Sega CD or Sega 32X. The game is extremely fun to play, and blowing up the venomous Cobra while saluting the country is the perfect way to let off some steam. If you've never had a chance to defend the USA while teaming up with your buddies, give this game a shot. You'll be glad you did. If you enjoyed this video or any of my content, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. For only $1 a month, you have the ability to request videos and get a big shout out in one of my upcoming videos. Thank you.
I can't move!
On today's episode, we are talking about a group of superpowered individuals. These individuals, while super in their own right, as a team, there is just no one better. No, I'm not talking about the Illuminati. I'm talking about the Avengers. Specifically, Captain America and the Avengers from Data East. What's the story behind the strange assembling of the cast for this classic arcade game? Let's find out as we smash into the history of Captain America and the Avengers. Marvel superheroes have been featured in games starting as far back as Spider-Man for the Atari 2600. This was followed up by a series of graphical text adventures for the Commodore 64 and Apple. The series was entitled Quest Probe and featured the likes of Spider-Man, the Hulk, and the Fantastic Four, each in their own separate adventure. Even Howard the Duck got a game that was released by Activision to tie in with his ill-fated movie. The very first Marvel arcade game, though, was Captain America and the Avengers by Data East, released in 1991. Data East had been around for a number of years at this point, bringing out such arcade hits as Burger Time, Karate Champ, Kung Fu Master, Bad Dudes, and RoboCop. After seeing how insanely popular RoboCop was for his company, Data East designer Akira Ito tried to secure more popular licensed brands. He looked to America, where Marvel Comics had been a staple for almost 30 years. Right off the bat, he wanted the big guns, specifically Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk, due to Mr. Ito being the most familiar with the characters because of their successful TV shows in Japan. Unfortunately, Spider-Man was tied up by Sega due to their upcoming arcade game to be released later in 1991. Instead, he went in a different direction, opting instead to go for Earth's mightiest heroes, the Avengers. Once again, though, Mr. Ito ran into trouble when it came to character selection. Only part of the Avengers team could be used. Due to licensing agreements with other companies, the Hulk and Thor were off the table immediately. This left the team with Captain America, Iron Man, Vision, and Hawkeye. This was long before the Marvel Cinematic Universe popularized these characters and made them a mainstream success. Perhaps Data East had a crystal ball, and by doing that voodoo that they do, they were able to predict the future when it came to these popular characters. Captain America and the Avengers was released in the spring of 1991 by Data East. The game is a 4-player scrolling beat 'em up with the ability to play as Earth's mightiest heroes, or at least some of them. When I was showing my son Max some early footage from this video, he asked me why Vision looked so strange. He said it looked like somebody had dropped him into a vat of bleach, and I couldn't agree more. I don't recall Vision ever having this costume in the comics, so I had to go back and research it, and sure enough, he does. The game opens with the Red Skull and his assortment of mini-bosses taking over the world. The game is presented in a variety of comic-style panels, which makes it seem like a living and breathing comic book. Everything has a nice feel to it, including the fighting, which includes loads of thwacks and kabooms when inflicting damage on the enemy. Very similar to how the 1966 Batman series brought the comic book to life. You have a jump and an attack button. Pressing both buttons together will unleash your character's special move. Captain America will throw a shield. Iron Man unleashes a repulsor blast. Hawkeye shoots an arrow, and Vision fires a laser beam. Along the way, to aid you in your battle, you will see rocks and cans that can be picked up and thrown at your opponents. The game takes place across 5 stages of varying difficulty. You start out on foot, defeating endless hordes of bad guys until you finally take down the mini-boss of each level. Some of these characters have never appeared in any other arcade game. The list of bosses are Whirlwind, Giant Robot, Grim Reaper, Wizard, Mech Taco, which is a poor translation. It should actually be Taco, which is the Japanese word for octopus, Mandarin, Juggernaut, Ultron, Crossbones, the Red Skull, and finally the Mech Skull. To aid you in your battle, there are a few celebrity superhero cameos, such as Submariner, Wonder Man, Quicksilver, and the Wasp. Now everyone that knows me knows that I'm mostly a DC kind of guy with a little bit of Marvel thrown in. At the time, the only villain I recognized was the Red Skull. I had no idea who these other jokers were. This game is considered the top tier of bad translations. A lot of games that have been localized from Japan may have a word or two that just doesn't make sense. This game has at least 9 or 10. From, "You stupid men," to, "Why should it goes well?" Why indeed. Upon its release, the game proved to be a success in the arcades. Data East was in charge of the Sega Genesis version, and this one turned out the best. The gameplay is very similar to the arcade game, and it features almost all of the voice samples found within. The only thing that lets it down is the low quality sound samples, but this was due to the limitations of the Genesis hardware. To be honest though, this could have been better, but what we have is pretty good. Next up is the Game Gear version. This is basically the arcade game, simplified to run on 8-bit hardware. One notable change though is that it's strictly a solo affair, but you do get to pick any of the 4 Avengers. The graphics have been simplified as well, with the viewpoint changed to just a standard side-scrolling 2D beat-em-up. The music is similar to the arcade game, but there are no digitized sound effects. The playability is decent, but not quite as good as the Genesis or arcade game. Developed by Mindscape instead of Data East, which clearly was a giant mistake, is the Super Nintendo version. While graphically prettier than the Sega version, the gameplay is atrocious. The hit detection is way off, making an already difficult game almost impossible. The graphics are a bit more colorful and detailed than the Sega Genesis version, but the animation is missing a lot of frames. It's also missing approximately 90% of the sound samples found in the Sega Genesis and arcade version. After speaking with someone who was on the dev team who wishes to remain anonymous, he informed me that the reason that the game didn't turn out so well was because that dev time was cut in half and their lack of experience on the console. His bosses wanted to get the game out ASAP to capitalize on the arcade game's success. I was very excited to get this when I was a kid, as I knew how good the Sega Genesis version was, so of course, in my eyes, the Super Nintendo version had to be better. Talk about a disappointment. This is a giant turd of a game and should be avoided at all costs. Speaking of the wonderful development team at Mindscape, they took a crack at the Game Boy version. How do you think it fared? Take everything you knew and loved about the Super Nintendo version and strip it of its color, its dignity, and its manhood, and this is what you are left with. Horrible controls, slow, choppy animation, and totally average sound. Best to avoid it at all costs. There was also a Nintendo Entertainment version which took a lot of liberties with the property. The mission of the game is to rescue Vision and Iron Man from the clutches of the Mandarin. Then you have to go on to defeat Red Skull. The gameplay is okay, just not quite as tight as the arcade game. The graphics are nice and colorful, and there is some decent platforming action. In 1995, Data East would return to the superhero genre with Avengers and Galactic Storm. This is a one-on-one fighting game with pre-rendered graphics that look absolutely gorgeous. While the game has nice tight controls, the problem lies with the roster. There is only 8 playable characters. This may have been A-OK back in 1992, but here it is, 1995, and we are in the middle of Capcom fever and all of their excellent fighting games. Still, if you are a Marvel fan and a fighting game fan, this is one to definitely check out. And that about does it for Captain America and the Avengers. The game may be a bit on the short side, but it's loaded with Marvel references and has plenty of action to boot. With over 1,000 cabinets sold and produced, I'm sure you'll find one out in the wild somewhere. Check it out if you happen to see one. If you like my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's the only way it can grow. Thanks for watching.
Operation initiated.
Light gun games have been around since the 1970s, but none have had the complete package like Operation Wolf. The game sees you take on the role of a lone commando as he attempts to rescue the hostages and get them back to safety. What's the backstory behind the creation of the #1 arcade game in the world? So reload your weapons, stock up on grenades, and get ready to fire, because this is the history of Operation Wolf. The year is 1987, and legendary title designer Tomohiro Nishikado is wanting to try something new with his next arcade game. No stranger to working on hit arcade games, his first massive arcade hit was Space Invaders. Due to his contract with Taito, he was forbidden to reveal that he was the designer of the game. He would go on to work on other games, such as Chase HQ 2, Darius, Parasol Stars, and Bust a Move. He was looking at creating a light gun game, but could not decide upon a theme. Mr. Nishikado was always a fan of action movies, and this was right smack in the middle of the steroid 80s. Arnold Schwarzenegger was looking to either pump you up or blow you up.
I lied.
Sylvester Stallone was also big with a string of successful movies. Mr. Nishikado decided to take the best of both worlds, using elements of such blockbuster movies as Rambo and Commando. Operation Wolf opens with you parachuting into enemy territory as you try to rescue all 5 hostages. The game is split into 6 stages, with cutscenes advancing the story after each one. This was one of the very first arcade shooting games to feature a story. The game uses an optical controller housed inside of a gun assembly that is mounted to swivel and looks very close to a real Uzi. A geared motor was mounted inside for a very realistic recoil effect. There is a button on the side of the gun which will also let you throw grenades that do wider damage. Your mission on each stage is to take out a certain amount of enemies and vehicles such as trucks, boats, and helicopters, as indicated by an on-screen counter. The graphics are fantastic, with large detailed sprites and smooth scrolling. The sound effects are great, with atmospheric music and large rattling gunfire. You start with a limited supply of ammunition, and can find more as the game progresses. Dynamite bombs cause heavy damage to both enemy and your compadres, so be careful. Watch out for the machine gun power-up, as this will give you unlimited ammunition and increased fire rate for 10 seconds. Enemies will throw knives, grenades, and also shoot missiles, but if you're quick enough, you can shoot these out of the air. Your damage meter will slowly go up as you take more hits. There are nurses and boys running around in the background, and if you shoot one, you will take more damage. You will see energy power-ups scattered throughout the levels. These are disguised as pop bottles. That's right, pop, not soda, because I am from the Midwest. You will also see pigs and birds scattered about throughout the levels, which you can shoot for additional power-ups. The sixth and final stage is the airport, where all of the hostages who have been rescued have to make it to the airplane so they can escape. You have to protect them as they try to board the plane. If you fail to do so, the game is over. If you manage to rescue all of the hostages, you'll be awarded a point bonus based on how many were saved. After this, the game repeats, but at a higher difficulty. As I mentioned, there were light gun games in the past, dating back to Killer Shark, which was released by Sega in 1972. Other notable entries include Duck Hunt and Wild Gunman, both released by Nintendo. There was also Crossbow, which is going to be covered in depth by this YouTuber at some point. Another noteworthy light gun game was Chiller, which was one of the first arcade games to depict graphic violence. The game sees you dish out the pain to helpless characters and figure out how to use the various torture devices to finish them off. It's good old-fashioned family-friendly entertainment for ages 8 to 80. If you needed any further proof that this was, shall we say, inspired by the movie Commando, take a look at this arcade flyer from 1987. This game was the #1 arcade game of 1987, and you can bet your boots there were going to be home conversions. Ocean Software picked up the rights for all the home computer versions, and there are some that are really well done. Others, not so much. Before we get started, let's take a look at the classic NES commercial.
The terrorists have the prisoners. You're going in and hitting hard. Operation Wolf. You played it in the arcade. Now play it on your Nintendo Entertainment System. Fight your way past armored cars, gunboats, and a ruthless enemy. Grab extra ammo and power drinks because you're going to need all the firepower you can get. Operation Wolf. Only from Tyco. The only game in town. Available where your favorite video games are sold.
First on the list is the Spectrum port. Now sure, the game only has a few colors, but the sprites are large and detailed and the game is fast and smooth. There's a nice intro tune, but minimal sound effects. This was one of the few games to support the Magnum Light phaser gun. Probably the best 8-bit home computer port has to be the Amstrad version. Large detailed sprites, fast gameplay, and even a tiny bit of sound. Everything from the arcade game has been included. What else could you ask for? Now if you love having seizures while you play your games, then check out the MSX2 version. It felt like my eyeballs were falling out trying to play this. The sound effects had to be some of the most grating noises ever heard by man. The speed of the gameplay is way too slow. I always try to find something positive to say, no matter how bad the conversions are. So let me think about that. Nope, I've got nothing. Sticking with the 8-bit line of computers, the good old Commodore 64 version is not very good. The sprites are detailed, but they are too small when compared to the other 8-bit machines, let alone the arcade machine. The colors are extremely dull. The sound effects are pretty good, and so is the speed of the pointer. This was another game that utilized the Magnum Light phaser gun. The home version most people from North America are familiar with is the NES port. Utilizing the NES Zapper, the game was a big seller when it came out in 1988. As this was one of my favorite arcade games growing up, I was excited to try it with the Zapper, but found the results to be lackluster. Playing with just the controller, the game was average at best. You better put on your Coke bottle glasses to play this because the sprites are tiny compared to the arcade game. There's a lot of flicker as well, but on a positive note, it does contain the storyline artwork in between levels. The Sega Master System version is up next, and while it's a little bit better graphically than the NES port, that's definitely not saying too much. Using either the Sega Phaser Light Gun or the control pad, the game plays pretty good, but there's a lot of flicker on screen. Sound effects are decent, as is the music. Interestingly enough, the box art for this version featured the artwork for the arcade sequel, Operation Thunderbolt. The MS-DOS version looks pretty good for an early PC release. One advantage that this one allows is the use of a mouse instead of a joypad for more accurate shooting. While the graphics look nice, the speed is too slow and choppy. The sound effects are PC speaker only, so you know they are terrible. Despite the choppiness, it plays pretty good. The Atari ST port looks very similar to the MS-DOS version. However, if you thought the MS-DOS version was slow and choppy, don't even bother looking at this one. This looks to be running at about 4 or 5 frames per second, especially when the action gets hot and heavy. Audio-wise, it's not too bad. It features the original voice samples from the arcade game, but with a loss of quality. Another version you can use with the mouse. Released by NEC only in Japan. The PC Engine version is probably the best home console port. The graphics have nice large detailed sprites with fast and smooth gameplay. Despite not having the original voice samples from the arcade game, the sound effects and music are very good. Surprisingly, the story artwork in between levels are completely different from the arcade game. The Amiga version is a pretty good conversion, featuring large detailed sprites with crisp and clear sound samples. The music is also very well done. Once again, you get to use the mouse, which greatly helps the accuracy. The game is faster and smoother than the Atari ST port, but it's a little bit choppy. The FM Towns version is definitely the best home version not running under emulation. Now granted, the FM Towns version cost equivalent to $3,000 when it launched back in 1989. So if you can afford it, this was the version for you. The graphics are near arcade perfect, with the ability to use the mouse to aim and shoot. Along with CD audio sound means you get an almost perfect replica of the arcade game. The game was also released in the Taito Arcade Legends compilation. Running under emulation, this is an arcade perfect game except for the Uzi. The NES port was released on the Wii Virtual Console, the only difference being you could only use a control pad to fire. It was not designed to be used with any other device, including the Wiimote. Operation Thunderbolt was released the following year in the arcades. Instead of a side-scrolling on-rail shooter, this one sees you on a jeep as you travel down the road taking out enemies. The gameplay is very similar to the first one, only this time it features simultaneous 2-player action. The last level sees you board a plane where all of the hostages are stored. You have to take out the final terrorist who is holding the pilot hostage. Once you enter this stage, you're not allowed to continue, so if you die, you die. The game was ported to a number of home systems, including the Super Nintendo. Operation Wolf 3 was released exclusively into the arcades in 1994. This was developed by East Technology and distributed by Taito. Upon first impressions, it looks very similar to the arcade shooter Lethal Enforcers, but with better animation. There is no storyline connection between this game and the previous two. Unlike the first two games, you have unlimited ammunition for your gun. You are allowed to carry 3 bombs at once, which you can throw with the slider underneath your weapon. The game is fast and furious, but it is a bit of a rarity at the arcades. There were never any home conversions of this game, so your best bet is probably trying it on MAME. The final entry in the series came with Operation Tiger, which was released in 1999. Featuring full polygon graphics, the gameplay is very similar to the previous 3 games. Sound effects and music are very good and the gameplay is very fast. This game was never converted to any home system, so check it out on MAME if you can't find it anywhere in the wild. And that about wraps up the history of Operation Wolf. If it's been a while since you've shot somebody or rescued any hostages, then be sure and give this game a try. There's nothing like mowing down a bunch of bad guys and saving the day. This is another arcade game where playing it on MAME just isn't the same. You need to feel that big bad Uzi in your hands to get the full experience. If you like my videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you like my content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's the only way it can grow. Thanks for watching. In the early 1980s, the arcade scene was still considered the wild, wild west of game design. A lot of game concepts were just being born and others were getting redefined and revolutionized. One such game is the classic Capcom arcade hit Commando. It took the basic military theme and added some intense, addictive gameplay into the mix. Why did the arcade game have 3 different names? So reload your weapon and let's kill some bad guys, because this is the history of Commando. The year is 1985 and legendary Capcom designer Takuro Fujiwara is busy designing not one, but 2 classic arcade games. The first game he was working on to be released that same year was a little-known game called Ghosts and Goblins. The other one was the classic overhead run-and-gun game Commando. There were overhead games released before, most notably Taito's Frontline, which was released in 1982. At the time, one-man army movies were starting to become popular, especially in the USA, with the likes of Chuck Norris in Missing in Action and Sylvester Stallone as Rambo in First Blood. Mr. Fujiwara recognized this and wanted to capitalize on its popularity. Although the game was called Commando here in the States, in Japan it was called Senjou no Ukame, or translated as Wolf of the Battlefield. In the summer of 1985, the Arnold Schwarzenegger Kill Fest Commando was released and was an instant classic. I've not been able to find any concrete proof that the name of the game was changed to appeal to fans of the movie, but if I had to guess, I would say it's almost a certainty. Commando was released in 1985 by Capcom. You take on the role of Super Joe, a generic soldier who is an army of one, waging war against the forces of evil. Now, even though Super Joe was dressed in World War II fatigues, you are dropped off in the jungle by helicopter, suggesting the setting could be Vietnam. Since this was the game that redefined the run-and-gun shooter, the game is not very advanced in terms of power-ups or vehicles. Your primary weapon is your machine gun, which thankfully has unlimited ammo, and your secondary weapon is a limited supply of grenades. Now, even though there are no weapon upgrades for your machine gun, it still packs a wallop. The grenades are useful for not only wiping out the enemy soldiers, but for areas your machine gun just can't reach, such as trenches and overpasses. The action is fast and furious, with the difficulty getting pretty hard pretty quick. The game takes place across 8 levels, with each level divided into 2 subsections. Your main goal is just to get to the end of the level while killing everything in sight. Occasionally you will have to rescue a POW or 2, so be on the lookout for them. At the end of each stage, instead of a boss fight, you have to kill a multitude of enemies. Once this is complete, you move on to the next stage. In between each stage, you are treated to a nice cutscene of your soldier either eating rations, cleaning his weapon, or enjoying a nice big drag off his cigarette. I was 12 years old when I first played this game, and when I saw Super Joe having a super puff, it started me on a path to my 5-pack-a-day habit. Here is a recent picture of me doing what I do best. If you manage to complete all 8 stages, you are treated to a very brief ending screen and the game starts over. The game underwent a few modifications when it was released in Germany. At the time, the country was very sensitive to games depicting humans killing other humans. All of the soldiers you face are now silver robots, and the name was changed to Space Invasion. This is similar to what Konami did with the Contra series when it was released in that country. In 1990, the sequel was released in the arcades. Known as Mercs here in the States, it features simultaneous 3-player action. Using the same vantage point as its predecessor, everything in the game has been dialed up to 11. Instead of just traversing up the screen actually scrolls left and right, giving you a wider play area. This time around, your team is known as the Wolf Force as you set out to rescue a former president who has been kidnapped by rebels in the fictional country of Zutula. The game takes place across 6 levels and plays very similar to the original game. There is one major change though, and that is the addition of a life bar, which makes the game just a tad bit easier. However, what Capcom giveth, Capcom taketh away. Instead of 3 lives this time around, you only get 1. There were also various weapon pickups, including a flamethrower, grenade launcher, assault rifle, and a shotgun. There is also a Mega Crush Attack power-up which kills everything on the screen. Certain stages even allow vehicles to be driven. In 2008, Wolf of the Battlefield Commando 3 was released on the PlayStation Network and Xbox Live. Super Joe was apparently retired and a brand new team of soldiers have been assembled. Similar to Mercs, the game offers 3 players simultaneous action with vastly improved visuals and audio. The gameplay is very similar to the previous 2 games, which is definitely not a bad thing. A nice addition for novice players is the addition of 4 difficulty levels. I enjoyed playing it when it first came out, especially in multiplayer, and still is a lot of fun to play to this day. Unfortunately, it only got average reviews when it was released. It's currently available for $5 on the PlayStation Network. In the game Speed Rumbler, the main character's name was changed to Super Joe for the US release. The same thing happened when Bionic Commando was released here in the States, with the main character's name being changed. Both Commando and Mercs were included as part of Capcom's Classics Collection, which was released for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. In 1986, Elite Software took a huge gamble and bet the company on the license for Commando. According to one of the programmers for the company, they agreed to pay Capcom £65,000 up front for the home computer rights, outbidding both US Gold and Ocean Software in the process. The gamble paid off and the game was a huge success across a multitude of home computers. The first version we are looking at is the Atari 2600 conversion. This was actually released by Activision, and just by looking at it, I couldn't tell it was Commando. This was also from the same company that thought Double Dragon would be a good idea for the 2600. This looks like Indiana Jones with the sparse desert backgrounds and only 2 enemies on screen at once. To be fair, the game is fast and controls reasonably well, even with only 1 fire button. I guess if you played the 800 or so other Atari 2600 titles, you could always check this one out. Let's stick with the Atari line and look at the 7800 version. This is really well done with nice detailed sprites and fast, frantic gameplay. One change from the arcade game is the ability to pick up different weapons such as a flamethrower and an upgraded machine gun. Launching grenades is no longer a problem thanks to the second fire button on the 7800 controller. There is even a pretty good rendition of the arcade theme playing in the background. Well done. Up next is the Commodore 16 version. If you've never had any experience with this system and thought the Commodore 64 was just way too powerful, then this system was right up your alley. Upon first glance after booting up this game, I thought I was playing whack-a-mole. The screen no longer scrolls and you have to clear each section of soldiers before you can move on to the next. There is no music and only rudimentary sounds. Moving right up the food chain with the Commodore 64, we have another excellent version. The music especially is a highlight, with it being done by Rob Hubbard. The game is fast and furious with nice detailed sprites and excellent backgrounds. The controls are nice and tight, but unfortunately there's only 1 fire button. One thing that lets the game down is that there are only 3 levels as opposed to the 8 in the arcade game. However, in 2014, Commodore Group Nostalgia released an updated version of this game which put back all of the missing levels. It also included the missing helicopter animations at the beginning and a multitude of other things, including the option of playing with updated music and sound effects or the original. The home version most people are familiar with is the NES version. This was an early title for the system, and unfortunately it really shows. This was programmed by Micronics, and it's just not very good. They try to jam way too many sprites on screen at once, and what we're left with is a glitchy, flickering mess. The level design from the arcade has also been changed completely. There are now twice as many levels in this version as opposed to the arcade game, as well as extra power-ups and bulletproof vests. At least this time around, we have a second fire button for the grenades. Let's take a look at the 16-bit Amiga version, and it is absolutely fantastic. The graphics are very close to the arcade game, and the scrolling is nice and smooth. The sound effects are really good, with excellent sampled sound straight from the arcade game. Everything from the original has been included, from the helicopter to the cutscenes. The only downside in this version would have to be the lack of a second fire button for your grenades. Otherwise, it is really well done and one of the best conversions on the Amiga. The Atari ST port, aside from a loss of color, is pretty much the same as the Amiga version. Moving back on down to the 8-bits is the Apple II version. The first thing you notice is how compact the play area is, making everything feel cramped and claustrophobic. The speed of the game is decent and it controls pretty well. The audio is virtually non-existent except for a few farts here and there. The Amstrad port is up next, and as far as graphics go, it looks pretty good. Everything has been shrunk down and the backgrounds are very sparse, but the speed of the game is close to the arcade original. We do get an excellent rendition of the theme song while we play. Moving right along, and not quite quick enough if you ask me, is the MSX version. The bad versions just keep on getting worse. If bright flickering lights and seizures are your thing, then be sure and give this version a try. I don't know what in the world they were thinking trying to release something this bad. The scrolling is a jittery mess and all of your enemies look like stormtroopers. The speed is decent and there is music while you play, but that doesn't make up for the abysmal controls and overall presentation. When it was released back in 1986, the Spectrum version received high praise, but honestly, I am just not seeing what the appeal was. Yes, the gameplay is smooth and it moves along at a brisk pace. But similar to the Amstrad version, the backgrounds are sparse and not very detailed. There is a nice rendition of the theme song playing while you play, which is always a plus, but in my opinion, it's just not very good. How about the Intellivision version? Boy, oh boy, I don't know what I'm looking at, but it surely can't be Commando. We have green as far as the eye can see. Despite the horrible Intellivision disc controllers, the game still plays fairly decent. The characters are nicely animated, but they move along slower than molasses. On a positive note, there is a good rendition of the theme song. Now let's close out the conversions with one of the worst ever, and that would have to be the MS-DOS version. Not only do we get a nice thick bezel on each side of the screen, but we get a smaller compacted play area. It reminds me of the old days of Doom, where you could make the screen smaller to make the game run faster. Beautifully ugly pastel colors along with semi-smooth scrolling makes this one for the ages. Since it's an early DOS game, the only sound we get is coming from the PC speaker, and it is absolutely atrocious, so have your earplugs handy. I think I would rather listen to my wife talk for 5 minutes than listen to this game. At least the gameplay is fast, but that's not saying much. Commando was a revolutionary run-and-gun game which set the template for many future titles. While the game is a bit short and a bit limited, what it does well. Although it's not the first game in the genre, it certainly made its mark and is fondly remembered to this day. If you've never checked out this game, give it a go. You'll be glad you did. If you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my content. It's the only way my little channel can grow. Thank you so much for watching. Happy little games. In the late 80s to early 90s, the beat-em-up genre was in full swing. Thanks to the simultaneous two-player modes that were now available, nothing was finer than partnering up with your pal and kicking some butt. We had classics such as Double Dragon, Bad Dudes, and Final Fight. Another bona fide classic came along in the early 90s that would help define Capcom as one of the best beat-em-up creators of our time. That game would be Captain Commando, which is what we are talking about today. Where did Captain Commando first appear? What other Capcom games does the character appear in? So fall in line, soldier, because we are going to take a look at the history of Captain Commando. The year is 1990 and Capcom designer Akira Yasuda has been tasked by his bosses to create a beat-em-up in the style of their other mega successful game, Final Fight. The main development team was knuckle-deep into the development of Street Fighter II. Whoops, wait a second, wrong video. Let's try that again. The main development team was knee-deep into the development of Street Fighter II. So resources were a bit limited for this one. After bouncing ideas around, his team decided to go back to a character from Capcom's past, Captain Commando. Captain Commando made his debut 5 years earlier as a mascot of sorts who appeared in the packaging of various Capcom games such as Gunsmoke, Mega Man, and Ghosts and Goblins. These were all released as part of the Captain Commando Challenge and featured an illustration of the captain on the back of the box. His original design featured a futuristic space hero with 2 ray guns and 2 large medallions around his neck with the letter C engraved on them. The name of Captain Commando came from the first 3 letters in the word Capcom for Captain and the last 3 letters for Commando. Even though the designs are totally different, the unnamed character in the Capcom game Section Z is said to be the captain himself. A design change occurred when he appeared in some later Capcom titles for the NES such as DuckTales, Willow, and Strider. This time around he appears in a pilot suit standing in front of a fighter jet holding his helmet. Apparently he likes alien chips now because one is sitting on his shoulder. The arcade design was to take most of the popular elements from Final Fight and expand upon them. Final Fight was such a huge hit they decided to up the ante and add an additional 2 players to Captain Commando for a total of 4 players simultaneous action. Final Fight featured large detailed character models, but for Captain Commando to accommodate this, the character sizes would have to be scaled back, but it wouldn't be that noticeable once the action reached a fever pitch. This game doesn't feature gritty urban characters like Final Fight, but instead goes the whole superhero route with its characters who as a team have sworn to protect the Earth. The game takes place in the year 2026 in the area of Metro City, which is the same city Final Fight takes place in. Captain Commando blasted his way into the arcades in 1991. As the story goes, the world is a cold and desolate place where crime rules with an iron fist. A team rises up to erase the filthy, dastardly criminals not only of Earth but also the entire galaxy. These are not just any ordinary group of criminals though. They have a lot of super-powered individuals among them. The dastardly villains are led by Scumicide, which requires a super team to take him down. The super team consists of Captain Commando, the leader of the group who uses energy gloves capable of shooting fire and electricity. He also uses Captain Goggles, which helps identify criminals from far away. The Captain Protector, which is a super tough material that can withstand 1 trillion degrees of heat. The Captain Gauntlet, which multiplies his power by 48 times. And the Captain Boots, which allows him to fall from great distances, protecting him from harm. A true superhero through and through. The other members are Ginsu the Ninja, who has a razor-sharp sword. His signature line is, "I'll slice them and dice them," which is a reference to the original Ginsu knives that were made popular by TV adverts in the 1970s. Mac the Knife, who is an alien mummy-like creature from outer space that uses subsonic knives which melt any enemy he hits. The character is too cool for school and even gives Fonzie a run in that department. And finally, Babyhead, who is a genius baby who designed and built his robot that he uses to wage war on crime. The robot he uses has plenty of weapons at his disposal, making him a fan favorite for players to use. He is also as cute as a button with his pacifier still in his mouth. The gameplay is very similar to Final Fight, with the standard 8-way joystick being used along with an attack button and a jump button. The attack and jump button can be combined to unleash a special attack just like in Final Fight. You are able to perform various combinations while standing or jumping, including grabbing your enemy and using a power move. You can also dash by tapping the joystick in either direction. You can pick up weapons including 3 different firearms and also shurikens, which can only be used by Ginsu. The characters can also ride robots once they disarm the enemy that is using them. The robots have their own damage meter, and if hammered enough, it will be destroyed. There are 3 types of robots that you can use, including a punching robot, a freeze robot, and a flame-throwing robot. Thankfully, there are items that restore your health, such as a big slap of beef, just like in Final Fight. The game's objective is to move your character towards the right, dishing out punishment as you move along, where you will eventually face the boss at the end of each stage. The game takes place across 9 stages, including Metro City, the Museum, Ninja House, Circus Camp, Seaport, Aquarium, underground base, the enemy spaceship, and finally Callisto, where you face the final boss, Scumicide. Some of the bosses you encounter include Dold, Yamato, Monster, Dr. TW, Blood, and finally the big bad himself, Scumicide. The game is fantastic to play and is even a bit more fast-paced than Final Fight, because now when you do a combo, your character moves forward rather than just standing still. The control you have over your character is finely tuned, which is exactly what you would expect from a Capcom game. The game was not the mega hit that Capcom was hoping for, so this was the only solo game to be released featuring the character. It did better in Japan than over here in the States, but it has since developed a cult following. The character has appeared in a few manga titles which fleshes out his backstory, and even had an action figure made. The 4 members of the elite Captain Commando squad would show up next in the arcade quiz game Capcom World 2. In Street Fighter Alpha 2, Captain Commando can be seen as a background character on Ken's stage. Captain Commando was a playable character in Marvel vs. Capcom 1, 2, and 3. He would also appear in Namco X Capcom. In the year 2006, released for the PSP, Xbox, and PlayStation 2, the original arcade game was released as a part of the Capcom Classics Collection, which was a bundle of fan-favorite arcade games. In 2013, Capcom Arcade Cabinet was released on Xbox Live and the PlayStation Network. This is a bundle of 17 games, but the unique factor is the inclusion of a casual mode which greatly decreases the difficulty of each game. This made Ghosts and Goblins a whole lot more fun for me. He appeared as a costume in Super Ultra Dead Rising 3 Arcade Remix Hyper Edition, and also Dead Rising 4.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Man, I love beat 'em ups. I wish you could play this at home.
Yeah, but there's no way this is gonna fit in your house.
Captain Commando!
So you kids want to see a future where an arcade fits right under your TV?
Yeah!
Then come with me to 2018. Say hello to the Capcom Beat 'em Up Bundle. This bodacious bundle comes packed with 7 of the hottest arcade games of all time.
Final Fight!
Knights of the Round! King of Dragons!
Hey, Captain Commando, that's your game!
Wow, Warriors of Fate! Plus it's got Armored Warriors and Battle Circuit! I never thought they'd come home!
And get this, all 7 games come with online multiplayer, thanks to the magic of the internet.
What's the internet?
And all this stuff fits inside that one box.
With room to spare, 7 games for the price of 1, all from your buddies at Capcom.
Radical. Yo, Cap, this is great and all, but we should probably get home soon.
Oh, sorry. Probably should have mentioned this was a one-way trip, huh?
You mean we're never gonna see our mom and dad ever again?
That's right.
2018 brought us Capcom's Beat 'em Up bundle, which was released for the Xbox One, PS4, Nintendo Switch, and PC. This is a collection of 7 arcade brawlers which included the original arcade version of Captain Commando. In Street Fighter V, Charlie Nash had a DLC skin of Captain Commando. There were only 2 conversions done back in the day, and the first and most well-known was the Super Nintendo version, which was released in 1995. A lot of what made the arcade game great has been carried over to this version. Since it's only a 16-bit machine though, certain sacrifices had to be made. It's now strictly a 2-player simultaneous game, but at least we have this. The original Final Fight only featured 1 player at a time. The sprites themselves have been scaled back from the arcade, but that is to be expected. The colors are not as vibrant when compared to the source material, and everything appears a bit darker. The blood from the arcade game is gone, replaced with yellow stars instead. Ginsu no longer slices his enemies in half as he does in the arcade game. The characters are missing some frames of animation as well. The robot suits from the arcade game that you wore are also missing completely. The sound effects are decent but are muffled for some reason. With any beat 'em up game, it's all about the controls, and this one is fantastic. There's a certain level of quality you expect from Capcom games, and this one does not disappoint. If you can get past some of the sacrifices that had to be made, then you will enjoy this on the Super Nintendo. In 1998, a conversion was made for the PlayStation 1. This was not developed by Capcom but by a company called New Corporation. They did a fantastic job, as this is very close to being arcade perfect. The game initially starts up with 3 players simultaneous play, but if you enter a secret code, you unlock the ability to use 4 players simultaneously. Since this was a staple of the original arcade game, I don't know why they chose to do this. Visually, it's very similar to the arcade game with nice, smooth animation. The audio was great with some nice rearranged tunes and meaty, heart-thumping sound effects. The controls are fantastic and are nice and tight the way they should be. Check it out if you ever get the chance. Captain Commando has definitely taken on a cult status as one of the original Capcom beat-em-ups. While not as big financially as Final Fight, the game is still fun to play, especially with 4 players. I see the arcade cabinet every so often, so it's not as rare as some of these other games. So if you ever get a chance to check it out, be sure to do so. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video and want to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Also, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching. In 1987, a game was created that revolutionized the industry. This game would take the tried and true overhead perspective and put it on its side for better play mechanics and simultaneous 2-player total carnage. The name of the game was Contra, or Grisor, or even Probotector, depending on what part of the world you were located in. Why was the name changed all over the world? Who was the box art modeled after? So grab your weapons and get to the chopper, because this is the history of the Contra series. The year is 1987, and Konami designer Koji Hiroshita is designing his next arcade game. He was a fan of the Hollywood run-and-gun action movies that featured Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone. He was also a fan of Commando and Ikari Warriors, two arcade games that took inspiration from these movies. He loved the two-player action Ikari provided, but what he didn't like was the overhead perspective. He wanted to create a run-and-gun action game, but this time using a side perspective. So if you take all these elements and mix them together with a little bit of aliens thrown in, you get the arcade game Contra. Konami had already produced a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up entitled Green Beret or Russian Attack here in the States. While the perspective is from the side, and its actions are a bit limited. Mr. Hiroshita also wanted to include an over-the-shoulder viewpoint level to break up the monotony of the side-scrolling sections. Contra was released into the arcades in 1987 by Konami. Konami was no stranger to arcade hits, having already released a number of arcade classics including Track and Field, Gradius, Boot Camp, and Russian Attack. The success of these games would pale in comparison to the worldwide popularity that would come to the Contra franchise. You take on the role of Lance Bean, which I believe he's related to this Bean, or Bill Reiser, as they set out to take down the evil Red Falcon organization. The game is a simultaneous two-player run-and-gun shooter which revolutionized the genre, similar to what Double Dragon did for the beat-em-up. You have a fire button and a jump button to help you avoid enemy fire. When your character is at a standstill, you can pull down to crouch. You start out with a standard machine gun with unlimited fire. However, you can upgrade your weapon by destroying the flying item capsules or the red pillboxes. There are a total of 4 weapon upgrades, including a rapid-firing automatic machine gun, a laser gun, a fireball gun, and a spread gun that shoots 5 individual bullets in different directions. Each power-up is labeled with the first letter of its name. For example, spread is labeled as an S, F for the fireball, etc. You will need all the extra firepower you can get, because if you take one shot, you lose a life. The game takes place across 7 levels with 3 varying viewpoints. There is the side perspective, the 3D over-the-shoulder vantage point, and finally the fixed overhead shooter. The game was great success in the arcades, so a number of conversions were released. Initially, the game was released just for the 8-bit line of computers. One major change that happened was the name of the game. In the 80s, the name Contra referred to the Iran-Contra affair, which was a political scandal that involved the U.S. selling weapons to Iran to fund the Contras. Now, since the name Contra was so politically charged at this time, the name of the home computer ports that were released primarily in Europe was changed to Gryzor, a completely made-up name that wouldn't offend anybody. The first thing that pops out when looking at the box art for the home conversions of this game are the 2 muscle-bound meatheads on the cover. The original arcade flyer showed 2 different characters posing for Lance and Bill, but when the game was released for the home market, they decided to redo the cover. Most people instantly recognized Arnold Schwarzenegger on the left side, but mistakenly referred to the character on the right as Sylvester Stallone. As you can see, both of these were taken from the movie Predator and are both stills of Arnold Schwarzenegger. The Spectrum is the first version we're going to look at, and it's a pretty good attempt. Yes, there's a definite lack of color, which makes it seem like you're missing your prescription glasses, But as far as the speed goes, it's right up there with the arcade game. The scrolling is fairly smooth, as is the animation. There is also music and sound effects while you play, which is a bit unheard of on the Spectrum. The playability is good for what it is, but it doesn't quite feel like Contra. The level layout is different from both the arcade and the NES, and the game is pretty difficult. The Amstrad version is up next, and it is the most impressive of the 8-bit computer ports. First off, this game doesn't scroll, which does hinder the gameplay just a bit. However, everything else is top shelf with detailed, colorful sprites and smooth animation. The speed of the gameplay is very close to the arcade original. You even have the same power-ups and level design from the arcade. There is no music, but the sound effects are adequate. An extremely well done conversion. Up next is the good old Commodore 64 version. Even as a child, I thought, can't the Commodore do a better version than this? While it's a competent shooter, it just doesn't feel like Contra. It feels like something our old buddies from TierTech Software put together on a Friday afternoon. The ropey animation and collision detection play a major factor in the game getting such a low score. You also can't read or find the jump button, so you're stuck with having to use the spacebar. The visuals are muddy and not very detailed. The music and sound effects are excellent though. It's just too bad the rest of the package isn't quite as good. The Japanese MSX2 computer got a pretty good port of the game. There is no scrolling, but the speed of the gameplay is very close to the arcade original. The animation is nice and smooth, and the music is very good. The game has been simplified, making it more of a mashup between the NES and arcade game with shorter levels but more of them. The weapon system has also been simplified with some weapons missing entirely. Most people are familiar with this game from the NES conversion. Rather than do a straight-up conversion of the arcade game, they decided to expand the game by adding new levels. The gameplay mechanics have also been refined, which makes it feel even tighter than the arcade game. The sprites and animation are very detailed with excellent playability throughout. The simultaneous 2-player action was brought over as well, and you are going to need it because this game is hard. To aid you in your quest to defeat the Red Falcon organization, you could always input the so-called Konami code, which would give you 30 lives instead of 3. Contra was also released for the Famicom system in Japan, but this time utilized a special VRC tube mapper which was designed by Konami that enhanced the game. Extra cutscenes as well as new background animations were created for the game. Another Contra variant was released in Germany, but not until 1990. Due to its strict laws on video game violence, the characters of Bill and Lance had to be changed to robots, and the title of the game was changed to Probotector. Aside from the robots, this was essentially the same as the USA version. Since the game's inception 32 years ago, there have been numerous sequels and attempts at reviving the series. I'm not going to cover every game, otherwise this would be a 9-part video, but I will cover the highlights. Super Contra was released into the arcades in 1988. The game takes the alien invading motif and ups the ante by 10. The game is essentially the same as the original Contra, taking place across 5 levels. It does retain the side-scrolling format, but switches to an overhead perspective for certain levels. Most of the weapons are the same except for a bomb gun which replaces the flame gun. The game was ported to the Amiga, MS-DOS, and the NES with the title changed to Super C. They didn't want to confuse players with the Grisor name, and the name Contra was still taboo. In 1991, the first portable version of Contra was released, and that was Operation C for the original Game Boy. Who would have thought that an underpowered black and white handheld could pull off such a good version of the game? Not me, but it's a really good conversion, especially considering the hardware. This is basically a stripped down version of Super C on the NES. The machine gun power-up and the laser rifle are both missing, leaving only the spread shot and the flame gun. There is a new homing bullet gun that will actually chase down the enemies. Unfortunately, there is no multiplayer option, but it's still a great Contra game. In 1992, released for the Super Nintendo, was Contra 3: The Alien Wars. This was a high watermark for the series and is truly one of the greatest Contra games ever released. The game was developed with the original arcade team providing input. The game uses numerous examples of Mode 7 and sprite rotation to produce an immersive arcade boss rush experience. The music will also change as the stage progresses, giving it a much more cinematic feel. They incorporated heavy drum beats and orchestral chords whenever the tension was high. The bosses are huge, multi-jointed creatures that actually fill the screen. There are plenty of weapons available, including a nuclear weapon that will wipe out all enemies on the screen. If you're a fan of Contra and have never played this game, you owe it to yourself to check it out. Contra Hardcore was released for the Sega Genesis in 1994. This was Konami's one and only Contra game for the system, and boy did they knock it out of the park. The game looks very similar to another Sega Genesis run and gun game, and that is Gunstar Heroes, but only cranked up to 11. This is without a doubt one of the most gorgeous Genesis games on the market, and also one of the hardest. At least this time you can carry up to 4 weapons at once, allowing you to switch to whichever one you want on the fly. You can also select one of 4 characters to use. There are branching paths with multiple endings, which greatly improves the replay value. The variety of levels is simply amazing, and your jaw will drop at some of the special effects that are used all throughout. If you feel this version is too difficult, be sure and try out the Japanese version, which includes a life bar, allowing you to take 3 hits before you die. After a couple of disappointing entries on the PlayStation 1, the series returns to form with Contra Shattered Soldier on the PlayStation 2. The game returns to the two-dimensional style of gameplay, and this finally feels like a next-gen version of Contra. In my opinion, certain games should always be done in the 2D perspective, and I believe Contra is one of them. Although the game is strictly 2D, the game uses full polygon graphics instead of sprites, which makes the visuals absolutely gorgeous. The controls are very similar to Contra 3 on the Super Nintendo, except there are no power-ups in the game. You are equipped with 3 permanent weapons that can be switched to at any time. The weapons are a heavy machine gun, a flamethrower, and a grenade launcher. There are multiple endings in the game, but the ending you receive is depending on how well you play the game. The game introduces a hit rate system which gauges the number of enemies killed as a form of performance metric. The higher the hit ratio along with the minimization of lives lost is imperative to receive the better ending. It's a cool little feature that makes the game all that much better. Contra 4 was released for the Nintendo DS in 2007. The game chooses to ignore the newer play mechanics implemented and returns the power-up system found in previous games such as Contra 3 on the Super Nintendo. Speaking of, the game feels like a sequel to Contra 3: The Alien Wars. It uses both screens of the DS for a much wider play area. You have a grappling hook which will let you zip between screens. Similar to the arcade version of Super Contra, if you pick up the same weapon twice, you will get an improved version of that weapon. The game is fairly long, clocking in at just over an hour of play straight through. This is one of the best portable versions of Contra on the market. To celebrate Konami's 50th anniversary, the Contra collection was released on Xbox One, PS4, Nintendo Switch, and Steam. This is a collection of the best Contra games available, including the arcade, NES, Famicom, Super Nintendo, Game Boy, and Genesis. The collection retails for around $15, so this is well worth the money spent if you're trying to scratch that Contra itch. And that about wraps up the history of the Contra franchise. As I mentioned, I didn't cover every game, but I did hit the highlights and left out the lowlights. The Contra franchise revolutionized the genre with its simultaneous 2-player run-and-gun action, and any game that came out after it owes it a debt of gratitude. If you are a fan of these types of games and have never tried this series, You owe it to yourself to check it out. Be sure to grab a mate to play with because the series is very hard and you're going to need all the help you can get. Or you can just cheat and use the Konami code like I did. If you like my videos and want to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It's the only way my little channel can grow. Leave a comment below whether you liked or disliked the video. Thanks for watching. This video was a special request by Todd Reed. Thank you so much for supporting me. If you grew up in the early 1980s, chances are you were a fan of Michael Jackson. Long before it was cool to want to be like Mike, kids everywhere were dressing up in leather outfits and learning how to moonwalk. Thanks to a little innovation called MTV, the music video scene exploded and it catapulted superstars into the stratosphere. Today, we are going to talk about the 1991 Sega arcade hit Moonwalker. What is the connection between Sega and Michael Jackson? What other games did Michael Jackson work on? Let's find out as we learn about the history of Moonwalker. Michael Jackson was always a bit of an eccentric. He was blasted into superstardom with the release of Thriller, and immediately rumors began to circulate about how odd he really was. Whether it was buying the Elephant Man's bones, sleeping in a hyperbaric chamber, or palling around with a chimpanzee named Bubbles. Rumor has it that he befriended Bubbles because he was convinced that one day those damn dirty apes would take over the world and he wanted one by his side. No, not really. I just made that one up. Another early love of Michael Jackson was video games. He was essentially a video game nut and not only had all of the classic consoles, but quite a few arcade games as well. Sega was one of Jackson's favorite companies and would work with them periodically over the years. Rumor has it that he even did some of the soundtrack for Sonic 3, but left it uncredited because he wasn't happy with the sound capability of the Sega Genesis. Speaking of Sonic, according to the original designer Naoto Oshima, Sonic's red and white shoes were inspired by Michael Jackson. His shoes were inspired by the cover to Michael Jackson's Bad, which contrasted heavily between white and red, that Santa Claus type color. I also thought that red went well for a character who can run really fast when his legs are spinning. In 1998, the anthology film Moonwalker was released. This was to help promote his Bad album with a series of short films that came from the mind and imagination of Jackson himself. The short films represent different stages of Michael Jackson's career, with some of them being longer versions of his music videos. A couple of years before Joe Pesci was getting screwed at the drive-thru,
They you at the drive-thru, okay? They you at the drive-thru. They know you're gonna be miles away before you find out you got okay?
he took on the role of Mr. Big, who wanted to get the entire world addicted to drugs and wanted to start with the children first. The film itself is very bizarre, with Michael eventually turning into a robot and then finally into a spaceship. Because the concept of Moonwalker was wild and wacky stuff, Jackson approached Sega about turning it into a video game. With Jackson still being such a huge star at the time, this was a no-brainer for Sega. Before we talk about the console and arcade versions, I have to mention Moonwalker, the personal computer game released by US Gold. The game takes place across 4 levels, with each level offering a distinct style of play. The first 2 levels sees you collect certain items, but the perspective is a top-down view, making it seem like you're a rat in a maze. The third level switches to a side perspective where Michael has to shoot the bad guys. Level 4, you are in Mr. Big's headquarters fighting off his stormtroopers. If you manage to survive, you save the children and win the game. In between levels there are some nice cutscenes, but overall, I never really cared for this version. it gets a bit tedious and a bit boring in my opinion. Moonwalker was released in 1990 by Sega in the arcades. The game was developed in tandem with the Sega Genesis version, although it was done by a separate team and plays completely different. The game was developed on the System 18 hardware, which was a host to a number of games including Alien Storm. And Shadow Dancer. The board was notorious for having a suicide battery. What this means is, once the battery reaches the end of its life, the arcade game becomes unplayable. The game is an isometric 3-player simultaneous beat-em-up that sees you attempt to thwart Mr. Big and rescue all the children. The controls are very straightforward with an attack button and a dance button. The game takes place across 5 levels with mini bosses all throughout. There is a unique piece of music that plays in the background on each level. Level 1 is the cavern and the song is Bad. Level 2 is Amusement Quarter and the song is Smooth Criminal. Level 3 is Night Street and the song is Beat It. Level 4 is the Graveyard, and the song is Another Part of Me. And level 5 is the Evil Fortress, where a different version of Bad plays in the background. The game was supposed to have the song Thriller playing in the Graveyard level, but since Michael did not own the sole copyright to the song, they were not able to include it. Rather than make physical contact with your enemies, Michael zaps them with an electrical force that can be charged by holding down the fire button. This is described as his magical powers in the arcade manual for the game. If you are close enough to your enemies while doing this, Michael will perform a melee attack instead using his magical powers. Your special attack in the game is called Dance Magic. Similar to Adam West's powerful Bat-Tusi, if the special attack is activated, all the enemies on the screen are so captivated by Michael and his dancing that they have to stop what they're doing and bust a move right along with him until they die. Depending on the dip switch settings, each credit entered will give you 2 dance attacks. You can replenish your stock of dance attacks by rescuing more children. No idea if Michael dangles the children out of the window after rescuing them or not. Even your old pal Bubbles the Chimp makes an appearance. He is hidden on each level, but if you manage to find him, you are transformed into a robot that can shoot missiles and fire lasers. The graphics, and in particular the animation, are fantastic. The sound effects and music are excellent too, but I can't play too much of it, otherwise I may get a copyright strike. In between levels are cutscenes that feature trademark Michael Jackson sounds and noises. In the sound test for the arcade game, there are 2 pieces of music that are unused. They are both high-quality versions of Smooth Criminal and Beat It, but this time the lyrics are actually accompanied with the music. No idea why these were not used. The Sega Genesis version was released a few months later. As I mentioned, this is a totally different game which uses a side perspective instead of isometric. The goal of the game is the same. You have to rescue all the children and bring Mr. Big to justice. The controls are fairly straightforward. You have a magic button, an attack button, and a jump button. Once again, Michael uses the power of dance to take down the various thugs, gangbangers, and mobsters. Throughout the game, you will search through dumpsters, car trunks, and looking inside closed doors for the various girls you have to rescue. You have to be thorough in your search, because once you find everything, your old pal Bubbles the Chimp lands on your shoulder and shows you the way to that level's boss. Your primary attack is your dancing. By pressing the attack button once, Michael performs a single dance move, throwing out the dance magic. This causes your enemies to fold like origami. The longer you hold the attack button, the more powerful the dance magic is. Michael will spin and finally throw his hat, taking out any enemy in his path. Michael will lose energy with the more powerful attacks that he uses, but by rescuing the children, your meter will replenish. And finally, if you hold the attack button down long enough, Michael will use his special move, which makes all the enemies stop what they're doing and dance right along with the King of Pop until it kills them. Michael Jackson's rhythm is so good, even Fido has to get in on the action and shake his tail. The infamous Moonwalk is also in the game by walking backwards and holding the kick button. Every so often, a shooting star will appear on the screen. If you can jump up and grab it, you will transform into a robot that shoots lasers. You are invincible during this time, but unable to rescue any children until you revert back to normal. The last level sees you board a spaceship for the final battle with Mr. Big. The graphics and sprite work are really good, although even back then I wasn't that impressed with the animation. What's there is good, but it's not very smooth. The sound effects and music are fantastic, with excellent chip-tune renditions of the same tunes found in the arcade game. These include Another Part of Me, Billie Jean, Beat It, Bad, and Smooth Criminal. When the game was first released, which was Revision 00, the theme song to Thriller was included on the graveyard scene. For whatever reason, they decided to pull it, and starting with Revision 01, they replaced it with Another Part of Me. Thankfully, the prototype ended up in the hands of a collector, and he dumped the cartridge for all of us to enjoy. The game was a huge seller for Sega and would headline a series of celebrity-endorsed games put out by the company at the time. There was also a Master System port, which was essentially a stripped-down Sega Genesis version. The graphics and animation are good for an 8-bit machine, but can't compare with the Genesis. The music is good for the hardware, but again, can't touch the 16-bit version. Bubbles the Chimp is also missing for some odd reason. Perhaps he was busy planning to take over the world. The game is still fun to play, but if I had my choice, I would always go with the Sega Genesis version. And that wraps up the history of Moonwalker. Thanks to Michael Jackson's interest in video games, we were able to play this truly unique game. If you are a fan of Michael Jackson and love video games, you owe it to yourself to check these games out. You'll be glad you did. Happy little games. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Growing up during the golden age of arcades was a magical time. It was the wild, wild west of game development where no concept was off limits. You had innovative titles that turned out to be true classics such as Pac-Man, but then you also had titles that just didn't click such as the game Gotcha. This was a two-player maze game in which one player chases the other player trying to score the highest points by grabbing them. Instead of a traditional joystick, players would grope a large pink plastic dome, which is something I would replicate 20 years later. Out of all these concepts and ideas, my favorite would have to be the beat-em-up genre. There is nothing better than having two players side by side kicking the snot out of those dastardly villains and saving the day. Today, we are going to talk about the game that came out in the late 1980s by the name of Vigilante. What arcade sequel did this initially start out life as? So grab your nunchucks and get ready to fight, because this is the history of Vigilante. The year is 1987 and arcade goers are enjoying the beat-em-up genre thanks to innovative titles such as Double Dragon. This game took the country by storm, but with great success comes many imitators. The concept seems fairly simple. Your character walks to the left or right, beats up a few bad guys, and walks some more. Eventually, you will face a boss and finally either rescue the girl or save the world. One of the first massively successful beat-em-ups was Kung Fu Master, which was released by IREM in 1984. It was created by Takashi Nishiyama and was inspired by martial arts films such as Bruce Lee's Game of Death and Jackie Chan's Wheels on Meals. A couple of years later, IREM developed a sequel entitled Beyond Kung Fu Return of the Master. This got as far as location testing in Japan, but apparently it underperformed, so they canceled it. Rather than scrap the project entirely, lead designer Mr. Nishiyama decided to revamp it with a familiar American setting. Vigilante was released by IREM in the arcades in 1998 and distributed by Data East in the US. As the story goes, just outside of New York City, your girlfriend Madonna has been abducted and thrown into the back of a prison van by the nefarious skinheads. It's up to you to take the law into your own hands, become a vigilante, and save the day. This is a one-player only action game, so your buddies will have to stand aside while you lay the smackdown. The game takes place across 5 levels with a mini-boss at the end of each one. Similar to Kung Fu Master, the game scrolls on a single plane, only this time with movement from left to right. You have a punch button and a kick button, with the kicks obviously having a longer range. You do have a jump kick at your disposal, but you have to time it just right, otherwise you will leave yourself open for enemy attacks. The enemies are absolutely relentless, and they come bearing all kinds of weaponry, including crowbars, chains, guns, and knives. Occasionally, you will come across nunchaku, or nunchucks as they were called when I was growing up here in Illinois. These can be picked up and used as your primary weapon. If you get hit while holding them, they will disappear forever. Or at least until you find them again. Sometimes you will get attacked by a group of 2 or 3 guys who are apparently trying to hug you to death, similar to the Yeti in WCW. You have to wiggle your joystick to knock them loose. In between each stage is a short cutscene that expands upon the story. The 5 stages in the game are Mean Streets, Junkyard Showdown, Bridge of Dragons, Back Streets of Fire, and Under Construction. The bosses for each stage are difficult at first, but becomes much easier once you learn the patterns. The last boss in particular is extremely difficult, as he is twice your size and his health regenerates at a rapid pace. Something else you have to contend with is the time limit, with each stage having only 99 seconds to complete. Sometimes it comes right down to the wire at the end of each stage. After you defeat the 5th and final boss, you rescue Madonna and all is right with the world. The game was ported to a number of home computers and released by US Gold, mostly in Europe. The home computer ports definitely needed a 2-button controller, but unfortunately we were stuck with only one and it really hindered the gameplay across all versions. The first one we are looking at is the good old Commodore 64 version. Now everyone knows I have a soft spot in my heart for the system, but then again, that could just be the multiple stab wounds from my wife. Anyway, everything feels just a bit off about this conversion. While the sprites are large and fairly detailed, the gameplay speed, in particular the walking animation, is very slow when compared to the arcade original. Most of the villainous baddies made it over, although no more than 2 appear on screen at the same time. The backgrounds look decent, but the colors are extremely dull and muddy, with everyone having a gray skin tone, for example. The animation is nice and smooth, but it doesn't make up for the slow gameplay. The music and sound effects are okay, but after a few minutes it started to grate on my nerves. Other sacrifices were made, such as the cutscenes having the graphics removed and the boss on the second stage. Instead of fighting 2 people, you only fight 1. I grew up with the game on disc format, but apparently it was a multi-load tape version in Europe and it was extremely slow. Next up is the Spectrum version, and it comes in 2 flavors. You can try it in full-blown monochrome mode, or you can add a splash of color. And I do mean just a splash. There is a bit of color clash going on, and personally I preferred playing the monochrome version. The developers wanted to keep the speed of the game as close to the arcade original as possible, so the animation is not quite as smooth. This helps the overall speed of the game, but the scrolling is still a bit choppy. There is no music, and what we get in the sound effects department sounds like a queefing contest I witnessed down in old Mexico. Short, sweet, and to the point. This version also features the cutscenes in between each level. It's actually one of the better conversions on the 8-bit line of computers, but that's not really saying much. Sticking with the 8-bit line of computers is the Amstrad version. While the colors are nice and vibrant, everything else is not. The speed of the game is pretty consistent to the arcade original, but the choppy scrolling is just terrible. It gets even worse with more enemies on screen. This was developed in conjunction with the Spectrum port, so a lot of the frills from that version made it over, such as the cutscenes in between each level. The controls are merely adequate due to the choppy scrolling and some questionable hit detection. There is no music and one loud slapping sound for the FX. Let's take a look at the Atari ST version. While everything is large and fairly detailed, the game is quite a bit slower than the arcade game. The scrolling and animation are also choppy, making it hard to enjoy this conversion. The music is not very good either, but not as bad as in other conversions. The dodgy hit detection rears its ugly head in this one as well. Now let's take a look at the Amiga version, which in my opinion is the best out of all the home computer ports. The graphics are nice and detailed, especially the backgrounds, which are very close to the arcade game. The gameplay speed is just a little off, but it does feature some decent animation. It also has some nice digitized sound effects straight from the arcade game, and they sound great. The controls are pretty good, especially for only having one fire button. We even have some nice parallax scrolling to top it off. Overall, it's a pretty good computer conversion. The Sega Master System version is really well done. There were a few changes made, including Madonna being renamed Maria, and the skinheads now called the Rogues. First off, let's talk about the controls. We finally get two buttons, and it really helps to replicate the arcade game experience. The background detail is exceptional, with everything from the arcade making it over, including all of the cutscenes. The gameplay speed is on par with the arcade version, although the enemy animations are a tad bit choppy. It features nice music, but if you have a Japanese or Korean Master System console, it is compatible with the FM sound unit. This sounds fantastic, but I will let you be the judge. A few questions have been raised whether or not the MSX version is official or just a clone. I put on my PatmanQC detective hat, and here's what I found out. It is official, an official turd. Just look at those graphics. The MSX computer is capable of a whole lot more, so I don't know what is going on here. The animation looks like it was ripped from a 1950s Soviet Union cartoon. The music is so bad, I decided to stop playing for 20 minutes and go talk to my wife to get the ringing out of my ears, but that only made it worse. The controls are not very responsive either, with sluggish movement and poor hit detection. There are also only 3 levels. Other than all these issues, A+. And finally, let's take a look at the creme de la creme, which is the PC Engine version. This is very close to being arcade perfect, with large detailed sprites and excellent animation. Everything from the arcade game is here, although the cutscenes are just slightly different. The sound effects and music are excellent, which complements an already great package. The controls are nice and tight, with 2 buttons at your disposal, and it feels just like the arcade game. The game was released as part of IREM's Arcade Hits collection back in 2011 for Windows. This is a collection of 18 arcade titles, including Kung Fu Master. These are all running under emulation, so you get the actual arcade experience at home. It was also released for the Wii Virtual Console in 2017. There is a fantastic remake on the PC which features excellent graphics and animation, but the sound effects and music have been upgraded considerably. You also have 5 weapons to use this time around instead of just 1. The gameplay has been polished up a bit as well, but it still feels exactly like the arcade game. There you have it, folks, the history of Vigilante. It didn't last very long here in the arcades, but I always enjoyed it, with my favorite home port being the Amiga version. This is an excellent beat 'em up which can be completed in just under 15 minutes. Short and sweet, which is just the way I like them. If you've never had a chance to try this game out, make sure you do. You'll be glad you did. Happy little games. Before we get started, be sure to leave a like if you enjoy any of my content. Also, let me know down below what games you think I should cover. Thanks. The Run and Gun game. Any retro gaming fan of this genre will instantly think of Green Beret, Contra, or Metal Slug. Thanks to Hollywood movies featuring Hollywood heroes such as Rambo and John Matrix from Commando, this new genre took off, no pun intended, like a shot. You couldn't just have a lone soldier on his way to take out an entire country as the backdrop, you also had to have a rock-solid game to back it up. Today, we are going to take a look at another unique spin on the run and gun concept that was released way back in 1989. The hero of this game wore a bandana and kicked not only the butts of every enemy they encountered, but also infiltrated our hearts as well. No, I'm not talking about the adventures of Big Bad Bertha. I'm talking about Midnight Resistance by Data East. What innovation did this game use? What were the differences in the home versions of this game? So STFU and grab your BFG because this is the history of Midnight Resistance. The year is 1988 and arcade manufacturer Data East is looking to create another run and gun classic. By this point, Data East had become a powerhouse in the arcade industry, releasing such classics as Karate Champ, Kung Fu Master, Bad Dudes, and RoboCop.
You are under arrest.
Thank you.
In 1987, the company released Heavy Barrel. This was an overhead view run and gun and featured an 8-way rotating joystick similar to SNK's previous arcade title Ikari Warriors. Movies such as Rambo and Commando were still hot commodities, especially in Japan, so designer Koji Akibayashi had the idea to create a sequel to Heavy Barrel, but this time use a side perspective similar to Contra, only with a rotating joystick. Midnight Resistance blasted its way into the arcades in 1989. This is a simultaneous 2-player co-op run-and-gun action extravaganza in which you take on the role of 2 unnamed brothers who just happen to look like Frank and Sylvester Stallone. You take control of your steroid-induced hero as he sets out to rescue his grandfather, mother, father, sister, and possibly even his brother from another mother, from the evil clutches of the alien known as King Crimson. The home versions would change the story a little, but I'll get to those in just a bit. Every arcade game should have a hook that would bring people in, and this game it would be the rotating joystick. This allowed you to aim in an independent direction while moving in another. The game was designed with this feature in mind, as the enemies will come at you from all directions, so this joystick definitely comes in handy. As I mentioned, this control scheme was done with Ikari Warriors and the prequel to this game, Heavy Barrel. This was the first time it had been done with a side-scroller similar to Contra. The game takes place across 9 levels with various sub-bosses all throughout. Another unique aspect of this game, along with the rotating joystick, were the keys. The concept of the keys were introduced in Heavy Barrel, but it was fine-tuned here and is a nice little break from the chaotic gameplay. These are dropped by various enemies, and you would need to collect them to unlock chests to gain additional firepower. You can carry up to 6 keys at once, which can be redeemed at the end of each stage in the weapons armory. The last time I saw so many keys, I was at a key party. The weapons that you can choose are the 3-way or spread shot, flamethrower, rapid fire machine gun, shotgun, homing missiles, and nitro flares. You can also equip secondary backpack weapons which do a ton of damage. The 2 backpack weapons are Barrier, which provides 3 satellites above your player and protects you, and the Shower, which will rain bullets from above. If you lose a life, you do lose your keys and weapons, but you are respawned right next to them, so it's easy to pick them back up. The level design is varied with detailed graphics and lots of colors on screen. There is some nice, smooth, sexy parallax scrolling on most of the levels as well. The sprites are just as detailed with smooth animation. The music is quite catchy and is definitely something you will remember. The sound effects and voices are top-notch as well. The sub-bosses are extremely large, but thankfully they are not too difficult to deal with. The controls are top-notch, especially when playing on an actual arcade machine. The levels you will encounter are Outer Complex, Inside the Complex, the Forest, the Caves, Into the Lair, The Caves Part 2, The Docks, Vertical Climb, and the Belly of the Beast. Some of these sub-bosses that you will face are tanks, a giant buzzsaw, jet fighters, the Electrified Man, a giant naval ship, and the final boss, which is a huge floating head and could be mistaken for my wife.
Homing missile.
Before facing off against the final boss, you have the option of unlocking your family if you have enough keys saved up.
Fire! Fire! Homing missile.
Once you defeat the boss, you climb to safety with your family while a nice melodic tune plays in the background. The game was very successful in both Japan and North America, so naturally the conversions would soon follow. Ocean Software released the title with development house Special Effects in charge of the home computer ports, while Data East themselves took care of the Sega Genesis version. None of the home conversions were able to replicate the rotating joystick, so changes had to be made. The Zenix Spectrum version is first on our list, and boy oh boy is there some serious color clash going on. Everything is large and quite detailed if you can actually make it out. The scrolling has also been sacrificed using a flick screen mode instead of the nice smooth scrolling found in the arcade and other home conversions. The storyline has also been changed for all of the home computer ports. In these versions, a ruthless commissar has kidnapped your family, which includes your grandfather, who was a world-famous research scientist. You have to rescue them in time before Gramps gives up the goods and reveals his secrets to the evil commissar. No idea why this was changed. All of the levels have been included, as well as the cutscene halfway through the game and also the ending sequence. We do get music while we play, and while the tunes aren't the greatest, with the occasional queef slipping in and out here and there, it still sounds pretty good for the Spectrum. It's also only single player. Sticking with the 8-bits, let's take a look at the Amstrad version. This was ported over from the Spectrum, which is unfortunate because I believe the machine can do much better than this. The added splash of color really does help, but the problem lies with the speed. While not too terribly slow, the gameplay is just not arcade accurate. Similar to the Spectrum though, everything else from the arcade game made it over. The one area where it suffers is the sound. If you are looking for short, sweet queefs right in your face, then this is the version for you. Playing it on the emulator and cranking up the speed by 60%, it made the game so much more playable. Again though, it's only a single player affair. Fun. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next, and what a conversion it is. The graphics are a bit on the chunky side and the colors are a bit of a mess. It's also not quite as detailed as the other versions, but it does feature the arcade smooth scrolling. Another huge advantage is the use of the SID chip, and it sounds fantastic. Even though the graphics are a bit on the average side, the playability more than makes up for it, as it actually feels like the arcade game except for the rotating joystick. Everything from the arcade made it over, including the cutscenes and the ending. Unfortunately though, it's only a single player game. The Atari ST version looks good with graphics similar to the arcade game. The backgrounds are detailed along with the sprites, but the problem comes with the colors, as everything has a washed out look to it. Another problem is the scrolling, which uses a flip screen method and not the smooth as butter scrolling found in the arcade game. Something else that has been sacrificed is the sound. This is now also a single player game as well. Overall, not a bad conversion, just not very good either. The Amiga version is up next, and it is the best home computer version in my opinion. Graphically, it's very similar to the Atari ST, but with a bit more color on screen. Everything does appear to be washed out, although not as bad as on the ST. The scrolling is silky smooth, just like in the arcade original. The sound effects and music have been transferred over nicely to the Amiga, and we even get some of the voices from the arcade game. The controls feel great and also features the beloved 2-player co-op mode, something no other version, even the Sega Genesis, offers. The Sega Genesis version was the only port handled by Data East themselves, and despite some loss in color, looks very close to the arcade original. Once again, the story has been changed even further, with your family being kidnapped by the dastardly Crimson King. He is a drug lord who has kidnapped your grandfather, in particular for work he has done on a serum to stop drug addiction. Your unnamed character from the arcade game has now been rechristened Johnny Ford, who was a member of the Narcotics Control Agency. The sprites are extremely large and detailed, with the same boss designs found in the arcade game. The level design is almost perfect, with nice smooth parallax scrolling as an added bonus. Some of the backgrounds aren't quite as detailed as found in other versions, which is a bit strange. Of course, we get music and sound effects while we play, and although I prefer the Amiga sound for this game, the Genesis version isn't too bad, although it is missing all of the voices. The playability feels great with tight control over your player. Surprisingly, it's only a single player affair. And that takes care of the history of Midnight Resistance. This game doesn't get mentioned quite as often when it comes to the run and gun genre, but I think it should be, as it's a lot of fun. Due to the rotating joystick, the best version to play is the arcade original, as it hasn't been properly replicated on the home front. If you've never had a chance to blast some baddies and collect some keys, then you should definitely check this game out. You'll be glad you did. Happy little games. In the mid-1980s, it was a great time to be a teenager, especially if you liked action movies. Steroid-fueled with explosions of Mundo were all the rage, and I lapped them up like a dog eats peanut butter. Some of my personal favorites during this time were Rambo Part 2, Commando, and Predator. Arcade manufacturers took note and wanted to cash in on the action flick craze. SNK would later go on to create the stellar Neo Geo, was one of the earliest companies to produce such a game, and that is the one we are talking about today, Ikari Warriors. What was the major influence for this game? What was so unique about the controls in this game? So put on your bandana and get ready to kill the bad guys, because this is the history of the Ikari Warriors trilogy. The year is 1985, and SNK designer Kaiko Liu is hard at work on her first arcade project. Japanese companies had no problem stealing ideas from their competitors, and arcade manufacturers were no different. A lot of times they were hesitant about putting a game into a test market because spies from other companies would be on the lookout and report back to their bosses. If it was something good, they were instructed to create something similar but get it done as quick as possible. Miss Liu saw Capcom's Commando on test location and set out to create something similar but only with 2 players. Late in development, the bosses at SNK had noticed how popular the character of Rambo was and instructed her to change the characters to more resemble the muscle-bound Vietnam vet. So she took off their shirts and gave them bandanas. What kind of a game is this? And was ready to unleash this game on the world. The characters look extremely similar to Rambo, with the title character even having the same color bandana. So I'm surprised that a lawsuit was never brought about. People are often curious where the name Ikari came from. The name is taken from the Japanese title of the movie Rambo, Ikari no Dasutsu, or Rambo the Furious Escape. Commando was a huge hit, but SNK wanted to update the gaming experience by adding 2-player simultaneous play and also innovate the controls. They decided to add an 8-way joystick with a rotary dial built in, allowing you to move in one direction but shoot in another. 1982's Frontline had something similar with a rotating dial. The first game to use the rotary joystick was SNK's Tank 3, which came out a year before Ikari Warriors. This game is also considered the forerunner to the Ikari lineage and even featured the character of Ralph. Ikari Warriors blasted into arcades in 1986. You take on the role of Ralph Jones and Clark Steele, who also appeared in SNK's later hits King of Fighters and Metal Slug. Their mission is to reach the village of Ikari while blasting enemy soldiers and blowing up tanks in an attempt to rescue their commanding officer, Colonel Cook. The game is a simultaneous 2-player run-and-gun adventure in which you have to traverse up the screen, similar in style to Commando and Gunsmoke. Let me just start out by saying that this game is very difficult as getting off the toilet after Taco Tuesday. Along with the rotating joystick, you have 2 buttons at your disposal, one for grenades and one for your machine gun. You do have a limited supply of ammunition, but there are plenty of refill icons along the way. Your ammunition will be restored if you die. The various enemies who will attack you are the standard blue enemies, red enemies who will drop power-ups which will increase the power of your bullets and grenades, give you more ammunition, or even kill all enemies. There are also kamikaze soldiers who would love nothing better than to ruin your day by blowing you up. Not only do you have to contend with all of the soldiers, but there are tanks that move back and forth trying their best to blast you to Kingdom Come. There are helicopters that will try to shoot you from above, and even giant rock faces that will spit arrows at you. Sensors will pop out of the ground after stepping on certain spots that will unleash homing missiles, which are pretty much unavoidable. It is possible to commandeer tanks which will not only let you shoot the enemies but run them over in a nice, satisfying way. You have to be careful though, because some tanks are rigged to explode as soon as you get nearby. While in the tank, it is possible for it to catch on fire and explode, so you have to exit it as quickly as possible. As with most games at the time, it's a one-hit wonder type of world, which means you will die repeatedly. The difficulty is brutal, and it does help to have that second player. The game takes place across one long scrolling level with roadblocks appearing every so often. The very last area sees you come across the dictator who has kidnapped Colonel Cook, but apparently he got on the wrong side of somebody because he is just a rotting corpse. Somehow his chair is linked to 4 fast-firing cannons, so you have to be on your toes. After defeating them, you head on up to free Colonel Cook, who has apparently had a touch of gigantism in the meantime because he is huge.
That's what she said.
Colonel Cook is literally 4 times the size of our titular heroes. After completing the game, you receive a nice congratulatory screen, complete with a few phrases of English thrown in. In Japan, the arcade game is known simply as Ikari, and the enemies were neo-Nazis as evidenced by a large swastika on the carpet at the end of the game. The game was ported to a number of home systems, which I will cover at the end of the video. 1986, Victory Road was released by SNK. This is the follow-up to the successful Ikari Warriors, only this time taking place in space. As the story goes, after rescuing Colonel Cook, Ralph and Clark board their plane and are headed back to America. Suddenly, a storm appears and they are transported thousands of years into the future. They meet an alien creature who says the dastardly villain Zong Zip has taken over the land. It's up to our two shirtless, muscle-bound heroes to blast their way to his palace and end his dictatorship once and for all. The game follows the same layout as the first one, with one long continuous scrolling level with mini-bosses breaking up the monotony. The controls themselves are pretty much unchanged, with the rotating joystick making its return. Once again, you have dedicated gun and grenade buttons, only this time you have unlimited ammunition, which also includes any weapon you happen to pick up along the way. Some of the weapons you can pick up include large bazookas, which will plow right through the enemies and certain walls, a steel boomerang that will cut the enemies down like a knife through butter, and a giant sword which will kill enemies just by touching them. Another sort of power-up is the eyeball, which will let you locate hidden items in the scenery. The tanks from the first game are missing, but there are various suits of armor which will let you take a certain number of hits before disintegrating. You either have to toss grenades or use the bazooka to blast through walls to either retrieve hidden items or to create a pathway. The enemy types are much more varied this time around, including green little buggers who sort of resemble something I leave behind in my toilet after Taco Tuesday. Spiders that have a tendency to hop all around, guards who will shoot you mercilessly, airborne creatures who will swoop in from the side shooting you while flying erratically, and statues that will blast starbursts. There are actual bosses this time around instead of the roadblocks found in the first game. Every so often a green tile will appear on the ground. If you happen to step anywhere near them, you will be transported into a mini-boss fight with either a multi-headed dragon or the same stone face that taunted you at the beginning of the game. The final boss is particularly brutal, so you better have plenty of coins or have the game set on free play. The graphics have been given a slight upgrade over the original, and so has the sound, with some digitized samples thrown in from not only the final boss of the game, but also Clark and Ralph when you come back to life. The difficulty has also increased, making an already near impossible game flat out impossible. It's still fun to play though, especially in 2-player mode. The game was ported to a number of home systems, including the Commodore 64, Apple II, NES, Atari ST, Amiga, Amstrad, ZX Spectrum, IBM PC, and PSP.
Come on, let's fight. Come on, let's fight.
After 3 well-deserved years of R&R, Ralph and Clark were called back into duty in Ikari 3: The Rescue. At the time, arcade beat-em-ups were extremely popular, with the likes of Double Dragon and Golden Axe ruling the arcades. This prompted SNK to make the biggest change in the gameplay that nobody saw coming. Instead of taking place in space, the heroes are transported back into the jungle to rescue the president's son from a terrorist organization. Like its predecessors, this is a simultaneous 2-player game that scrolls not only vertically but also horizontally as well. The game takes place across 6 varied levels with pretty cool mini-bosses at the end. The first thing you notice after being dropped in the jungle is that you have no weapons. That's right, this is no longer a run-and-gun shoot-'em-up extravaganza, but instead is turned into a punch-and-run, which is what I would do whenever I got into a fight. Instead of the standard gun and grenade buttons, you have dedicated punch, kick, and jump buttons. The punches are delivered just a little bit faster than the kicks, and they do dish out more punishment. You also have a jump kick, which is the most powerful tool in your unarmed arsenal. The rotating joystick from previous games also returned, but doesn't quite feel right in this scenario. Thankfully, SNK released a version of the game with a standard joystick which plays a whole lot better in my opinion. There are 3 weapons you can pick up in the game, which include knives that the soldiers drop and will do significant damage. They will also throw grenades that you can pick up and throw back at them. Speaking of explosions, you can find dynamite barrels or crates that will instantly destroy anything in its perimeter. The 3rd weapon you can pick up is the rifle, which holds 20 shots and sure feels good after all that knuckle-busting action. If you are worried about the guns that the enemies carry, well, worry no more, because they have been stripped of their machinery as well. That's not to say that the game is a cakewalk, because the sheer amount of enemies is overwhelming, just like the previous 2 games. The enemy types are not as varied as in the previous games, with a standard multicolored soldier who all have the same abilities and a roughneck with a headband. They come at you from all angles and will gang up on you relentlessly. One other new enemy type are the bearded soldiers who can kill you in 2 hits. You also have to contend with tanks and helicopters, and if you don't have a gun, it's fist on metal as you punch and kick it to the great beyond. A thankful addition is the inclusion of a life bar, but that comes with a not so thankful inclusion of a time limit. The time limit is displayed as distance from the enemy, and the more you traverse through the level, you gain more distance from them. If it reaches 0, the enemies surround you and you are captured. At this point, you have to start the entire level all the way back at the beginning. The graphics have been given a significant upgrade from the previous 2 games, and they look really nice with fairly good animation. The levels are also much more varied, including rivers, jungles, deserts, bridges, and heliports. There are even nice cutscenes in between each level. The music and sound effects have also been upgraded with a few clear voice samples thrown in. It's a fun game to play, but in my opinion, it just doesn't feel like Ikari Warriors without the traditional weapons. The game was converted to a few systems, including the NES, Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and PSP. Ralph and Clark would later go on to become playable characters in the games Metal Slug 5 and 6. They would also appear throughout the King of Fighters series as a part of Team Ikari, alongside other members such as Leona and Colonel Cook. Now let's talk about the various conversions. It was converted to a number of platforms with varying degrees of success. The one glaring difference from the arcade, aside from the graphics and sound, is the lack of a rotating joystick, which means you can only shoot in the direction you are facing. The home version most people are familiar with is the NES version. To pad out the game, additional content was added in the forms of more varied enemies and gameplay. There are now even large warriors who use clubs instead of guns, elite soldiers, and also robots. Even the mini-bosses at the end are completely different or in the wrong order. Instead of one long continuous stage, the game is split up into 4 separate ones, but these are all extremely long. The game is even more difficult than its arcade Big Brother thanks to its limited controls. There are still plenty of enemies and bullets are flying, so again, you have to be on your toes. Along with being able to drive the tank, you also get to fly the helicopter, which lets you use the machine gun to cut up your enemies like Swiss cheese. The only downside to this is that the helicopter will eventually run out of gas and crash with no way of being able to exit once you are in. The graphics are simply adequate with murky colors and limited sound effects and music. Back in the day, I enjoyed this one. Nowadays, not so much. Now let's take a look at the beautiful, stupendous, absolutely gorgeous. I'm sorry. Even I can only polish a turd so much. The Atari 2600 version is absolutely terrible. Possibly the worst arcade conversion ever. Considering this game came out in 1990, a full 13 years after the system launched, it's understandable why this version would look so bad. What's not understandable is why the people at Atari would continue to suck the unit dry, even though a competent conversion could never be accomplished on this hardware. The sprites are an ugly, discombobulated mess. When you kill an enemy or blow up a building, they just disappear as if they were a ghost. The scrolling is smooth, which is about the only positive thing I could find in this game. A variation, and I use that term loosely, of the theme song plays in the background, but of course it doesn't sound great. You can only move vertical and horizontal in the tanks and not diagonally, which you could do in the arcade version. Also, when your tank is hit, it just disappears, not even giving you a chance to escape. To top things off, there are no power-up icons either. If the name of your game is pain, then this is the game for you. Sticking with the Atari line, let's take a look at the 7800 version. This was released on aging hardware that was developed in 1983, although it wouldn't see a worldwide release until 1986. Despite these limitations, this is an excellent conversion and a whole lot better than the 2600 fiasco. The game opens up with the arcade attract animation, and we even get 2-player simultaneous action. The graphics and animation, while not quite as sharp as its NES counterpart, still look good with nice vibrant colors. The music is just there, which is about all I can say for it. It's not bad, but there are only 2 tracks in the game, one being the title screen music and the other which plays all throughout the game on a loop. The controls are much better than the 2600 version, allowing your character to move diagonally and also shoot in different directions while moving. Even the tanks can roll along diagonally. The collision detection is a bit iffy though, especially when trying to enter the tanks. This game more faithfully replicates the arcade level layout than the NES version, so arcade purists will absolutely love this version. The good old Commodore 64 received not 1 but 2 conversions of this classic arcade game. Let's take a look at the one released for the USA market. This one is not very good. The graphics and animation are not very detailed, with your character having blue hair instead of black. Also, when you die, every enemy, tank, and cannon that's on the screen will die and get destroyed as well. The game moves along at a fairly decent pace, but sometimes there is a ton of flicker on the screen. There is no 2-player simultaneous mode, along with totally different stage layouts from the arcade game. The hit detection is not good either, especially with the grenades. Thankfully, a short time later, something much better would come along. A few months later, the game was released by Elite in Europe for the Commodore 64. This is a brand new conversion built from the ground up. The first thing you notice when you boot the game up is that it has the original arcade opening if you're playing Crashing in the Jungle. The graphics look a whole lot better, although the sprites are smaller in scale than the USA version. The animation is also well done and a big step up from the previous game. The sound effects and music are put to good use, with the Sid ship belting out a good rendition of the arcade's theme song. There doesn't appear to be any flicker in this game as well, which is always a good thing. The controls feel fantastic and are nice and responsive. The horrible collision detection that was present in the USA version is much better in this one. Overall, every category is a big step up from its USA counterpart. Sticking with the Commodore line, let's check out the Commodore 16 version. The graphics, while a bit on the blocky side, are fairly detailed, but the problem comes with the colors. They are extremely dull and drab. The animation is smooth along with the scrolling, which makes for a better gameplay experience. There is no music, although we do have sound effects, which are absolutely eardrum piercing after a short time of playing. The controls are responsive, but you can only fire up and not necessarily in the direction you are facing. Although it's not a good conversion as we've seen before, it's not the worst one either. Let's take a look at the MSX2 version. The graphics are nice and detailed with colorful sprites all throughout. The animation is a little ropey, especially when there are lots of enemies on the screen. Speaking of enemies, they don't disappear when you kill them, they just lay on the ground until the screen is littered with bodies. There is music while you play, and the sound effects are pretty good, including some digitized grunts and groans, especially when you die. The speed of the game isn't bad, but it's not quite arcade perfect. The controls are decent except for the hit detection being just a bit off. I would have been perfectly happy to play this on my home computer back in the day. The ZX Spectrum version is up next, and when this was released, it received high marks across the board. The speed of the game is really quick and it flows quite nicely. The color clash has been kept to a minimum, although the sprites are monochrome. The graphics are detailed with smooth animation. We also get good sound effects as well. The controls are nice and tight and it feels like the arcade game. This is really well done, especially considering the hardware it's running on. Now let's check out the Amstrad version. The graphics are fairly detailed and so is the animation. The scrolling is not quite as smooth as the Spectrum version, but having that nice blast of color sure does help. We even get sound effects and music and they both sound terrific. The speed of the game is on par with the arcade original. The controls are very responsive and you will be blowing up the enemies with ease. This is a very good conversion, and if you are an Amstrad fan, you should check it out. The Atari ST version is the first of the 16 bits we are going to look at. The graphics are nice and detailed, with the character sprites immediately being recognizable. The animation is also nice and smooth, although there is some slowdown when a lot of action appears on the screen. We get the arcade attract screen and the intro, so this really does feel like the arcade game thanks to the presentation. You even have the option for simultaneous two-player action. The music is pretty good with a nice rendition of the arcade tune playing in the background. The controls are responsive, although there is no way they can replicate the rotating joystick. Overall though, it's a really good conversion. The Amiga version looks very similar to the Atari ST, but with slightly smoother scrolling and faster gameplay. The sprites are nicely detailed with smooth animation. Similar to the Atari ST, we get the arcade attract screens and also the intro with your plane crashing in the jungle. The music is excellent and a big step up from the Atari ST version. Two-player simultaneous action is also available, so you and a friend can blast the night away. The controls feel good despite not having that rotating joystick. This is one of the best home conversions that is not running under emulation. The MS-DOS version is up next, and despite it being an EGA title, it looks pretty good. That is, until it starts to move. The arcade gameplay is a bit on the slow side, but this one is twice as bad. It seems as if everything is moving at a snail's pace. While the sprites are fairly detailed, everything takes place in a windowed box, which limits the amount of play area you have. There are also only 4 enemies on the screen at once. Now, what about the sound? I don't know how else to say it, but it's farts and queefs all over again. Maybe I should expand my vocabulary. Bloops and bleeps are exactly what you get, so if I were you, I would shut the sound off in the options. Control-wise, it's not bad, but the slow gameplay really hurts it in my opinion. There is a 2-player option, so at least it has that going for it. An Apple II version was also released, but I could not get it running under 3 different emulators. A mobile version was also released, but took some liberties from the original. This time you can play as 3 different characters, with Clark and Ralph having 2 different versions of themselves. The second one having them dressed in their outfits from the King of Fighters trilogy. I could not get this one to work on either of my two emulators, so unfortunately I could not record any footage for it. The screenshots don't look half bad, although you do have to use the keypad to play. There were also versions of the game that were released on the PlayStation Network and Nintendo Switch, but these are running under emulation and are essentially arcade perfect. The entire trilogy was also released on Xbox One as part of SNK's 40th Anniversary Collection. These games came bundled with many other classic SNK arcade titles. Ikari Warriors is definitely a two-player simultaneous run-and-gun classic. I always enjoyed finding it in the wild, putting a few quarters in and seeing just how far I could get. It wasn't an original concept by any means, but it did take the tried and true formula and expand on it by adding new gameplay features and innovative controls. If you are a fan of Commando or any other vertically scrolling games, give this one a shot. You'll be glad you did. Happy little games. Even as a young peckerwood growing up in the cornfields of Illinois, the era of the Wild Wild West always appealed to me. My favorite, of course, was the Lone Ranger, and I always imagined throwing Tonto out of the group and taking his spot. I had my 6-shooters, mask, and cowboy hat just like my Western hero. As I got older, I discovered comic books and video games. One of the first arcade games I can recall playing was Gunfight, which was the first arcade game based on the Old West. This would see 1 or 2 players shoot across the screen at the other, trying to avoid the obstacles that could potentially block your shots. Another favorite Western-themed video game of mine was Gunsmoke, which is way overdue for having its own dedicated video. This Capcom shooter was not based on the long-running TV show as the title would suggest, but regardless, it was fantastic and brutally difficult for my 13-year-old self. Today, we are not talking about anything from the arcade. The game we are talking about is the third-person light gun shooter that didn't require a light gun, Natsume's Spectacular Wild Guns. What arcade game inspired the creation of this game? So grab your 6-shooters and get ready to fire, because this is the history of Wild Guns. The company of Natsume was founded in 1987. They started developing games for the original NES and MSX line of computers. In its lifetime, they released over 60 titles for numerous systems, with the most well-known of these being the Harvest Moon series, the Mighty Morphin Power Ranger series, and Gene Davis the Fishing Master. Prior to the release of Wild Guns, the company released a couple of my favorite Super Nintendo titles, including the Ninja Warriors, and Natsume Championship Wrestling. In late 1993, the higher-ups at Natsume wanted a video game for the Super Nintendo that could be developed and put on store shelves within 5 months. They wanted something that could be done cheap and quick, so they assigned a team to work on a concept right away. Because Natsume wanted to keep costs down, the team consisted of only 3 people: designer Shinichi Taniguchi, programmer Toshiyasu Miyabi, and composer Hiroyuki Iwatsuki. Mr. Taniguchi had been a huge fan of the arcade game Dynamite Duke, while Mr. Miyabi was a big fan of the Western-themed arcade game Blood Brothers. They decided to combine their visions and create a similar pseudo 3D shooting gallery style game. The first arcade game to use this style was 1988's Cabal, which was set in Vietnam and was actually the precursor to the previously mentioned Blood Brothers. Another one to use this style was SNK's Nam 75 for the Neo Geo. The development crew were fans of the spaghetti western starring Clint Eastwood and wanted to pay homage to the man with no name. To appeal to the female audience, they decided to include a female character by the name of Annie. Annie is a direct reference to Annie Oakley, who was a sharpshooter from the 1800s. She was so good with her gun, she could change a rooster to a hen with one shot. Aside from one character wearing a dress and having an ample bosom to boot, they play exactly the same. Wild Guns is a simultaneous 1 or 2 player affair and was released by Natsumi for the Super Nintendo in 1994. As the story goes, the young and beautiful Annie goes to see Clint, who is a renowned space bounty hunter. Her entire family has been abducted and killed by the Kid Gang. She persuades Clint to help her out in her fight to make them pay for what they've done. This is a 1 or 2 player game where the choice of playing as either Clint or Annie. If you don't like the colors of your character's outfit, you have 4 options upon startup. If you do select 2-player mode, you can both choose the same character, which does provide some alternate text in the intro. The rootin' tootin' cowboy action takes place across 6 western-themed steampunk levels. As I mentioned, this is a light gun game that doesn't require a light gun. You control the crosshair, moving it around the screen, shooting everything that moves. Initially, the development team had the crosshair locked to just horizontal movements and you moving your character left and right. They found this didn't work very well and changed it to what we know and love today. The controls are fairly simple, with you pressing Y to fire, X to throw bombs, and B to jump. You also have a lasso you can use to temporarily stun enemies. There are various power-ups to shoot along the way, including gold, silver, and blue rocks for increased points. You can also temporarily upgrade your gun, which includes a shotgun, machine gun, pop gun, grenade gun, and the Vulcan gun. This is the most powerful weapon in the game and can be achieved by filling up the bar at the bottom of the screen. The more enemies you shoot, the more it fills up. If you are using the Vulcan gun, you are invincible. One cool aspect of the game is that everything in the background can be shot, allowing for a much more interactive experience while playing the game. There is nothing better than going into the saloon and blasting everything inside, including the lights and all the signs. In addition to running left and right to avoid the various oncoming projectiles, you do have a couple of defensive moves such as the sideways jump, double jump, and the sideways slide. I'm not sure if the boot scootin' boogie is included or not. The enemies are pretty relentless, shooting you with their various guns and sometimes throwing dynamite your way. Luckily, you can pick up the dynamite and ruin their day by throwing it back at them. Because the action is so fast and furious and the bullets are flying like the south side of Chicago, a little pop-up will appear above your head when you are getting ready to take a hit, telling you to look out. This game is total carnage personified, and I like it. Every other stage is a bonus round, which is a straight-up shooting gallery in which you take out the rolling boulders, barrels, and cardboard cutouts of the dastardly criminals that litter this game. By default, the very first level you start on is Carson City. After this, you have a choice of which level to proceed to next. The only level which cannot be picked is the final level, which you need to complete all other levels before proceeding on to this one. The levels you encounter are Carson City, Desolation Canyon, ammunition depot. Gold mine. Armored truck. And the final fight. The bosses you encounter are Big Bertha, Desert Storm, Dungeness, Crystallian, Armored Express, and finally the head of the Kid Gang. If you manage to defeat the Kid Gang, you are treated to a quick ending with some rather excellent music playing in the background. The graphics are extremely nice, especially for a 16-bit title. There is lots of action and little slowdown even in 2-player mode with all the bullets flying and background destruction. The bosses are huge, sometimes almost filling up the entire screen. The sound effects and music are great, which sounds like a cross between Mega Man and something from the year 1883. The concept sounds strange, but it definitely works. The game was released towards the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan, so it didn't make that big of a splash. The collector market has taken notice of the game, with the cartridge itself selling for $300 to $400 and box copies selling for well over $1,000. In 2010, the game was released on the Wii Virtual Console. In 2016, Wild Guns Reloaded was released for the PlayStation 4. This could be considered Wild Guns 1.5 as it features a fresh coat of paint with its HD graphics and widescreen support. Along with the returning Clint and Annie, we are given 2 new characters to play as. Whereas Clint and Annie were just gender swaps who played identically, we are treated to a couple of new characters, including Doris, who was large and in charge, but instead of using guns, she throws grenades for long-range damage. The other new character is Bullet, who is, believe it or not, a dachshund. This crazy puppy doesn't carry a gun, however he does have a hovering drone which will auto-lock on the enemies. Since there are 4 characters to choose from, we also get 4-player simultaneous action, which is a lot of fun and really becomes hectic, but in a good way. Along with the 2 new characters, there are a couple of new levels, including Underground, which is a horror-themed stage, as well as Flying Ship, which is an aerial enemy fortress. There are also some new weapons to pick up, including a laser gun. A rather cool unlockable is the original Super Nintendo's music, although the new stuff is quite good as well. The game initially launched for the PlayStation 4 and has since been released on Steam and the Nintendo Switch. While making this video, I noticed that the game is currently selling for $15 on Steam. This is a heck of a deal, especially if you enjoyed the original. Wild Guns is a fantastic multiplayer Wild West shoot-'em-up. If it had been released earlier in the lifespan of the Super Nintendo, perhaps it would have achieved greater success, but that doesn't stop it from being a great game. If you've ever wanted to live on the days of yesteryear and you've never had the chance, be sure and check this game out. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thanks everybody so much for watching.